The 1960s proved to be a decade which stretched the applicability of political participation among citizens of the United States. The Vietnam War remained a divisive issue from its origin in 1964 until its end in 1973. Over the course of the war, many protests were organized that involved the burning of draft cards, organized marches and rallies, the fleeing of draftees to Canada in order to dodge the draft, as well as a host of other examples of internal dissent. The nature of these protests is to be cross-examined with the political findings of Michael Walzer, as well as Joseph Raz. A major cause for protests throughout the course of Vietnam rested with the notion that only the poor and uneducated were called upon to serve in the armed forces, that the policies of President Lyndon B. Johnson safeguarded the middle class and the wealthy from military conscription. Essentially, protesters would claim that government policy subverted the rights of some while protecting the rights of others. Since the war decimated the southern population of African Americans, Eldridge Cleaver asserted that many southern blacks were dying in Vietnam for something, quote, they did not have themselves. Naturally, this injustice garnered protests from citizens who questioned the moral justifications of the Vietnam War, as well as the right of the government to conscript individuals into military service when they did not give their consent. In his work, Walzer discusses the concept of willful consent, which he holds can be obtained two ways. The first entity which one can willfully consent to, Walzer argues, is that of specifically chosen groups. Consent within these groups is verified by one's public profession of loyalty to the group or intensive participation within the group and its principles. The second most complex entity which one may willfully consent to is what Walzer defines as the human community, the members of which commonly appeal to universal principles. The third, which Walzer defines as does not hold willful consent, is that by which one consents to the existence of a state and is usually taken on at a certain age. Thus, Vietnam draftees, being American citizens, could not escape the obligations that resulted from consent to the state, a consent given not voluntarily, rather by default. It is here Walzer turns obligation to the social contract upside down by suggesting that obligation is only legitimate if one willfully consents to an organization. Additionally, Walzer claims that obligations of an individual to a community reflect the duties of that person as well. In this context, anyone who willfully consents to any facet of the human community or was less non-committal and was a member of an organization that opposed the Vietnam War had, in fact, an obligation to fulfill. Walzer emphasizes that the worth of obligation within these communities is derived from interdependence of members within a group to uphold their common conception of right and wrong, or what we call morality. The anti-war movement then was composed of protesters who willfully consented to principles which strove to safeguard those whose lack of consent was undermined, the soldiers. Joseph Raz's work addresses the valid nature of the anti-war protest when he implies that members of a state are justified to disregard law when it violates their right to political participation. By positioning the Vietnam War protests within the proper place in America's history, one acknowledges that the civil rights movement was in simultaneously full swing, and thus the rights and privileges of African Americans were still being forged, yet they and others were still called upon by the very government which denied them certain rights. Additionally, Raz holds that protest, even in the form of civil disobedience, should not always have to be a last resort. Therefore, Raz would view the protests immediately followed by Richard Nixon's 1970 statement that American forces had invaded Cambodia as acts which were justified, because the legal alternative would have proven useless. The anti-war movement in its entirety, as would be held by Walzer and Raz, was a spectacle which was driven by obligatory political participation for members obliged by their willful consent to a group. Those members were acting on behalf of individuals who were denied their right to political participation. In other words, the soldiers that fought in Vietnam.